as, now that the recording is started, in this session, we're going to talk just about a couple of things you can do to help use students to use exams as learning tools. And the first thing we're going to talk about is some of the benefits from letting students engage in teaching each other. We know from Eric Mazur has found that, well, Eric Mazur has noted that when, as a little bit of background, he first started using Clicker. He was trying to explain some concepts to students, and they just didn't get it, no matter how many times he explained it. And then he tells a story about how he told them to explain it to each other. And then he tried asking them the questions again, and they got it. And basically, there's a lot of advantages from having students explain things to each other because they're just learning it. They're at a similar level of development. One of the problems that faculty have is a term that's called the curse of knowledge, that things that are obvious to us became obvious over years of working with this material. And it's a lot harder to tell or for students to be able to see the same patterns that we do. Our brains function differently. Different areas of the brain are activated for people who are experts in the field than novices. That it takes a lot more cognitive processing when people are first learning things. And it's hard for us sometimes to see the problems that they have. We recognize when we teach things often what areas students have problems with, but it's not always easy to see exactly what the problems are. And peer instruction in pretty much every study I've seen has been shown to be helpful. When students explain things to each other, it helps. They tend to learn a lot more effectively and a lot more deeply. And a video from an earlier session just finished rendering. Okay, sorry about that. A simple example of that was an experiment that a psychologist did where she gave people a list of, I think it was 20 or 25 songs. And she had one person pick a song and tap out the beat and then let the other people who were hearing the beat of the song guess which song it was. And then they asked the person who was doing the tapping how likely it was that people would recognize a song from the beat. They were all popular songs at the time. And what happened was the person doing the tapping predicted that the people listening would be able to, about 50 to 70%, they predicted typically, would be able to recognize the song just from the beat. But the actual amount was not different than random guessing. Because we were hearing it in our heads, it made sense, or that person doing it was hearing it in their head. It was obvious to them what they were talking about or what they were demonstrating. It wasn't so clear to the participants. And that's a problem we often fall into. And, one of the things faculty often note is that you really learn the concepts the best when you, I'm going to make sure everyone is muted here. Unmute if you'd like to hop in. But you learn things the best when you teach them, that when you have to explain things to other people, it forces you to clarify all the connections that you generally might have glossed over when you were first learning it. Because if you have to explain it to others, it forces you to have a deeper understanding. Most people found that when they were first teaching undergraduate students, they really understood those principal things in their discipline much more deeply than they ever did when they were a student. And we can give students the same experience by letting them explain things to each other. And the act of explaining concepts increases the ability to apply those concepts in new areas. There's a lot of research that suggests that. So one technique that's been used, and the Carl Wyman Institute has a lot of resources on these, is something called a two-stage exam. And typically, we give students an exam, they get it, they leave maybe feeling good about it, maybe not feeling so good. They get the results back, and it's generally worse than they expected. Not always, but often they get it. They tend to take it, look at it, and then perhaps discard it without ever looking at it again. But we can use these exams to help students learn. And with a two-stage exam, each student takes the exam individually. And then after that, you have them take the exam again, either the entire exam or a subset of the exam, where I'm going to Okay, mute again. If you'd like to say something, just unmute or type something in chat, and let me open the chat so I can see it, because I've got chat from the other room up and not from this room. Okay. Um, so you give students the exam, you break them up into groups, and then you have them submit a group response for either all the questions or a subset of the questions. And the traditional way of doing this, or the recommended way of doing this, is to do it immediately after they've taken the test individually. I wasn't able to do that because of the context. The questions, because of the timing of the class where I was using this, the questions could be equivalent, but not identical questions, or it could even be the same questions. And it could even be an open book part at this stage. And then you create the overall grade for the exam as a weighted average of the individual and group grades. And people use a variety of weights, anywhere from having 2/3 of the weight being on the original up to 90% on the original. But what happens in the second stage of the exam is when the students are working on it, they're clarifying things, they're explaining things to each other. And when I've done this in a classroom, it worked extremely well. It made the experience so much different because people were gathered around, all taking it, discussing it. They were saying, "Oh, now I get it." Or if someone would say, "Don't you remember when we talked about that, or we worked through those problems on those assignments?" And then, you could see the light bulbs turning on. And that was not always experienced when people made some mistakes initially, and then they got the results back and they'd get discouraged. Here, they were being reminded of things. They were being put in context. Their peers were explaining it to them. And generally, they ended up learning quite a bit from that process of both explaining what they did to others, as well as hearing the explanations from other students. And people ended up really enjoying that second stage of the process. And then you grade them again and you give them back the combined score. I did this in Echo 312. Again, the usual approach is to administer them back to back in the same class day, with 2/3 to 3/4 of the time allocated to the individual taking of exams, and then anywhere from 1/3 to 1/4 of the time for the group effort. You could use less time if it's a shorter version of it, or you might use more time if they're doing a more complicated task and it takes more time. But what I did was I administered the exam on one class day. I was teaching in a 50-minute class period. There were lots of concepts I wanted them to work through. It was an econometrics class, so they had to do a lot of calculations. They had to write lots of equations and work through and do some computations on it. And so I had them take it one day, and the next class day, I graded them in between. I created a new version of it with somewhat different questions, but very similar questions. I had them take it the next day, and they took about 1/3 of the time the next day, and then we went over it immediately after that. Because often we would take, often people would take the exam, and then, what was I going to say? I forgot, but I did see your question, and that got me thinking about that. How do I assign the groups? The way I do it in this particular class is I assign the groups by asking them to fill out a Google form, which just had I think it was just one question, which was, how many prior math and statistics courses have you had in the past? Because one of the most important things here is their prior background and their math skills, their background in statistics. So I tried to, and so they responded with a number of courses. I sorted them from the highest to lowest, and I assigned them based on that. So I just went down, if I had, say, 5 groups, I would just go through and assign them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just repeat that all the way through on the spreadsheet. And I did that transparently. I showed it right in class, and that way they could see that the groups were formed in a fair way, so that each group had a number of people who had 6 or 7 math courses, and each group had several people who only had 2 or 3 math courses before the class. They all had at least 2, but they saw that they were fairly balanced, and that students will often prefer to create their own groups, and they will often mention that. And and I'd ask them why they'd like to. They said, well, we work with a lot of these people in other classes, and we want to be able to work with people we've worked with before because we know them and we work well together. And my response to that each time that comes up is, well, but what about the people who haven't had as many? You've taken these courses together because you're a major, you're an applied math econ major, or you're an economics major, or you're a math major and you're taking some economics courses. And would it really be a very good balance of the class if all the people who had lots of classes together were in some groups and all the people who didn't know each other because they haven't had as much experience with this were in the other groups? And when I explain it that way, they generally buy in and they say, oh yeah, that is more fair. So try to do it in a way that's fair. You might do it by, there's any number of criteria you could use. If you're doing it yourself and you're not doing it on the screen in front of them, you might do it so there's a good gender balance or a good racial balance or other things. We're actually recording a podcast in February with an old friend of mine who did some research. She just presented at the American Economic Association meetings that found that when there was only one female in a group, women tended to participate much less in the group activities than when there were two or more. And so, the results of that suggested having at least a minimum number of women in each group was helpful in having a more active participation in the groups than occurred otherwise. And it also resulted in higher quality output, but of group product. So use something that would provide a balanced group, or I would recommend using something that provides a balanced group and not necessarily letting students do it, because when students do it based on their prior connections, it tends not to be the most equitable balance.
John, as a follow-up to that, so did you're grading the exams in between?
I did.
In any way inform your group? Not your groups. Did that then inform the questions you asked on the group exam?
And that was a nice thing there, because what I was going to do is only put in the questions that they all had trouble with. And then I saw there was a significant number of people that had trouble with almost all of the questions. So I didn't give them all of them, but it was pretty close to all. But yeah, when you grade them, the nice thing about doing it on 2 days is you have that ability to grade them and you can see where they're having problems, and then you can focus more on those things. And it seemed to work pretty well. The students seemed to find it very productive, and they all appreciate it. And they said they wish that was done in more of their classes. And so I just kept doing it since then. Now, last spring, it became a little more challenging for the second and third exams because we had gone remote. I only had 3 exams in the class, so that's going to change this semester. But what I did is I did it online. I created multiple equivalent versions of each exam questions. They had 7 questions, each of which involves some computation, some work, and so I created basically question pools for each one, so that there was only one question. Each version of the question would only have 2 or 3 students taking it, or in some cases it was 1 per student. And what happened though is all of the questions ended up being on Chegg. I had about a third of the group who posted questions and got feedback. So I had to have a little chat with them, and a number of students ended up failing. And it was unfortunate because many of them were seniors and so forth. But I did not anticipate that would be quite as severe of a problem. And part of it was because of the incentive structure I used. Because the exams were progressively cumulative, if students did better on a second exam, it would replace their first exam score. If they did better on the third exam, it would replace the first or second or both exam scores. And it was on the final that this really took place. And it was because the students who were struggling the most on the earlier exams all of a sudden each exam was, I think, 15 or 20% of their grade. So, but when they get to replace their other grades, I think it was 20%. So it could have been 60% of their grade was dependent on that one exam. And so they had a strong incentive to cheat. And they posted the questions. They got answers back within 15 or 20 minutes to each of them. Most of the answers they got were wrong, which made it really easy to identify it, especially when I saw different variations of really wrong questions coming back. So I I looked them up and I, reminded them and so forth. But so you have to be careful with that, with academic integrity, if you're doing something this online. So I gave them 48 hours. I'm going to probably do something similar, but I'm not going to let them do backtracking and other things. It makes the exam somewhat more challenging for students, but it'll do that equitably. And I want to set it up so that it's going to be more costly to engage in academic integrity violations, because I don't want to have to fail students,
Yeah.
But the
Yeah, you
second
have to
stage,
as you
yeah.
know, you got to make a big deal out of that because
I had
happens.
never had a problem with that in this class in like 30 years of teaching it, and so they were mostly juniors and seniors, and I just did not. In my freshman class, I'm used to that. Lower level classes, I'm used to it. I didn't expect so many problems from juniors and seniors, and they were going through some difficult times. They were moving home. They were trying to do all of this often on smartphones. They were trying to get loaner computers and other things, and it was difficult, and I felt really bad, but well, in any case, but in the second stage, they worked in groups. I just put them in breakout rooms, put the people in their same groups with the breakout rooms, and they took the test on Blackboard, and it was one group submission. I just added a question to it, and I created all different versions of it now because I was aware of this problem. So all the questions were new, and that also helped make it pretty obvious where some of the problems were. But in any case, they took the test again in their groups, and I graded them and gave them back. But by grading it, the first version of it, immediately after they took the test, I was able to give back their first attempts at it individually. And this was both in person and when we were online. And I was able to go over it with them, and I could let them explain it to each other. The people who did well on it could explain it. And that, again, worked just as well in an online format as it did in person. So it's worth trying it. There are issues. I used 2/3 of the grade was the individual and 1/3 was the second stage. They were all working it up really nicely. I just set up a category for each exam. Each category grade is weighted of the two components of the category. And then each exam category was part of their overall grade computation. So it's pretty easy to do. And we talked about selecting the
Well,
groups.
for you, I'm looking at this and saying I need a consultant to set up these.
It's basically all you do is you just you create a category for exam 1, a category for exam 2, a category for exam 3, and then you create a grade, which is a weighted average of those, which is the exam grade in the category. So you just put different weights on each component. I put 0.3333, et cetera, on part 2 and 0.66667 on part 1, and then create a weighted average of those, and that got put in. What I did is I didn't allow a makeup on that. Okay, a couple of things there. One is I didn't allow a makeup for students who missed either parts because I just used whatever the average for that category was. So if they only had, I didn't let them take a grade on it if they only showed up for the group thing. What I did in these cases is it's a small class where people generally didn't show up, where there wasn't generally a problem with people not showing up. There were a couple people who missed the first one, but because I count later exams as a replacement for the earlier ones, I just use their second grade as a replacement. I did give them 1/3 of the grade if they took it with a group, but I didn't count the first part. So those people who chose to sit out the first one, and I think it was a matter of choice based on how they did on later parts of it and the academic dishonesty issues that showed up. This was all while they were still face-to-face. They screwed up, and then the next exam was worth a bit more. But in terms of increased testing time on the group portion, because it was a group submission, I wasn't as concerned about that. You can do that easily when they're doing it individually, but I wasn't as worried about it with the group part because they were all discussing it and it was only one submission for the group. So, if there was issues with processing, a lot of that would have been resolved in their first attempt at that. I suppose that could be an accessibility issue, but I didn't get any complaints on that, and no one in the group had any reported accessibility issues, but that is certainly a concern. And again, a lot of people who have learning issue or have learning disabilities may not always report them. So that is something you should be cognizant of. And I did ask students if they had any problems to contact me, but it is something you should take into account somehow in any case. So, there was always one student who got a lower score in the second part. And what I generally did is I just let them keep it. It was usually someone who got something like a 99 or 100 on their first attempt. And then they let their peers convince them that their answer was wrong. And they shouldn't have. And I talked to them. I said, you were right. You should have been, you should have just stuck to it. But, I'd chat with them about it, but then I'd always give them whatever their original score was. Now, another technique that people use to help students learn from an exam is something called an exam wrapper. I'm going to stop the recording in the other session. Oh, I thought the other session was done and it wasn't. Oops. I'm sorry. I saw only one person presenting, and I'm not listening to the other room, so I'm sorry. Because we should be ending now, and I just thought it was done. Okay. The exam wrapper is another technique that people have used and is often recommended. When you give back an exam to students, you distribute it to students either in person or electronically, and then you have students provide reflections on how they prepared, the types of errors they made, adjustments that should be made. You collect that on paper electronically, and then you give it back to them before the next exam. It's something that's often recommended, and it can be done, and many people have used it and swear by it. By giving it back to them before the next exam, or you could send them a reminder or send it to them electronically before the next exam. It reminds them of what they said they did wrong and how they could do better the next time. And in theory, that should be really useful. The only problem with it is there's not really much evidence that it works, that students do report that it was helpful in the class, but when you look at a follow-up, most of the studies, well, all except for one study I've seen, shows that it has no impact on student performance in later classes or on student study patterns in later classes or on students' averages in later classes or pretty much anything else, with the exception of one study. And what that one study did is that there was a positive effect when it was applied in all the classes in one of the schools at the college. So when all the classes in a given school used exam wrappers, then it did seem to have a significant effect on student metacognition and student study habits when it was widespread. But when it was applied in a single class, which is how how all the other studies I've seen have shown it, it had virtually no effect. That single and Regan Gurung and Aaron Schleicher, I'm not sure of the other person's name or the pronunciation, have looked at these things and found no significant effect. And that's pretty much the result I've seen in most studies. So it's worth trying, and it certainly might help students in your class to do a little bit better, but there's a question of whether that effect will persist if it continues in future classes. So, so that's what I've got. So any questions? I had another document here. Let me see. Oh, and I have a resource here, which I meant to share, but I will do that right now. And here's some research on how to do each of these things. I'm going to share it. I'm a little disorganized because I was working through most of the night and I didn't quite get everything ready. It's going to deteriorate a little bit after this as the day progresses. I'm going to put that link in the chat, and 1 second, I'm going to change it so that you get a copy of the document. So if you click on that, it will copy a set of resources I put together with information on how to do this, how it works, and so forth. And now the other session did actually end, so I will end the recording. I'm going to have to splice those two videos together. Okay. So if you click on that, it should give you the option of adding it to your drive. You can make a copy of it, and it has links to all these, a variety of studies and resources on how to use two-stage exams or exam wrappers, as well as some sample questions. So any questions?
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Take care
Thank
of
you,
yourself.
John.
Thanks.
Get some rest.
Today's the worst day, and Rebecca will be back this afternoon, which will make it easier. So
Good.
I feel
Thanks
really
so
bad
much.
because I cut the other session's video off right in the middle of the